Hi folks, welcome to book number 22 on my Richard Lehman ranking videos, and at number 22 I have decided to place his 2003 novel Amara. Released 2 years after Lehman died, this was the first novel to be released under the Lehman name that I believe had some significant changes done to it prior to it being released. He had really Not in the Lonesome October, which I haven't talked about yet, came out just after his death, but was clearly written by him. Then we had No Sanctuary, which was also written, I believe, by Lehman, but perhaps edited by some third party just to spice it together as a finished work. I don't believe it was a complete novel in the form it was released in. Friday Night in Beast House has elements that I think feel very different from Lehman, but I also believe it was written by him, and it's only a novella. Then there was a 2 year gap where nothing came out, and then we got this, and then The Lake, and then another book I'll talk about later. And like The Lake, this has had some serious revisions and editing to it to make it a book. However, whereas The Lake feels like Lehman's wrote sketches of a novel and a third party has rewritten bits to make some degree of sense as a continuous story, this feels more like Lehman has wrote, I would say, if not everything here, at least the majority of everything here, and a third party has kind of assembled it in a slightly different fashion to how Lehman would have assembled this. Now, the story itself is about a mummy, a killer mummy, and I like the fact it's one of the few novels that Lehman did which is about some sort of supernatural entity. And going through his earliest writings and his career, the mummy aspect of this story appears to be something that Lehman wrote very early on. This was something that Lehman wrote in the late 70s, and was either something that was initially rejected or that he put on the back burner. If you look at Lehman's, on Lehman's terms, book, which is about his career up until the late 90s, he mentions a mummy book as something that he was writing back in the 70s that was rejected. And I think all of the things that concern Amara herself are from that book, something that he wrote very early on, like I say, late 70s. It feels like a late 70s Lehman work. It's got that style of writing where he was a little bit simpler, not as complex. And yeah, it's definitely a late 70s Lehman work, is what I'm trying to say. However, that's just one thread of many in this story. There's a bit about this blind woman looking for someone to come and meet her in the night. There's a bit about this Egyptian guy who is trying to, he's seemingly trying to sleep with everyone he can, but he's got a bit of a backstory, and he gets he knows about this mummy. There's this crazy, really horrible vagrant woman, described in some nauseating detail by Lehman here. Some of the things she does, she's particularly vile. Who she's got her own sort of story going on. There's a museum curator, female lead, if you like, who is working and in a relationship with, I can't remember if he's a police officer or a security guard, but them two, I think he's a police officer, them two also have something going on with this mummy. And then there's there's another story about these kids on the run from an abusive family life. And their adventures, because they want to get into Hollywood, and they meet a variety of unsavoury characters on their way that also get involved with this mummy. And then you've got what can only be described as this sex dungeon bit, where people are kept in cages and used as slaves, which also connects to this mummy. There is a lot going on. By layman standards, this is a very complex book. And what I think has happened here is that Lehman's wrote a number of either short stories or bits of novels that he was working on over the years, because Lehman had a lot of stuff on his plate. He was constantly writing. And I think that somebody has, whether it's family or his publishers, have taken all of these ideas and in the 2 years after his death have spent that time working on this to release it as a full fat book, and has kind of spliced all of these things together. The writing itself, the structure, the sentences, the way characters behave and speak and things that happen are very clearly Richard Lehman. I'm not suggesting that any of this has been ghostwritten in the same way that I feel elements of The Lake definitely have, in terms of how massive chunks of that don't feel like Richard Lehman at all in terms of how people speak. And I've mentioned all that, but that is, I would say, 60% Lehman, 40% somebody else. This, I would say, is 95% Lehman. What I think isn't is where they converge and the bits in which the mummy aspect connects to them. I think that's possibly been written by somebody mimicking Lehman's style, only having to do very basic tweaks to make it connect, but has still made it connect. I could be entirely wrong about this, I don't know, but that's just how it feels, because it is so disjointed and odd, excuse me, in how it all sort of connects. It's very tenuous. There's a lot of really unfinished bits here. I mean, the way in which the Egyptian guy, he meets up with this sort of unsavoury hobo woman, and their story just stops. The bits with the kids after the cages bit and the mummy bit, that just stops. The book itself, it does have a resolution, and then it literally stops. It's so jarring that I'd read the digital version of this and was ready to turn the page to find out what happened next, and that was just the end. It literally just stops. Very, very abrupt and odd. And there's a lot of it that just doesn't feel complete. Like I say, it feels like it's an assembled bit of a mess of a book rather than it being structured in this way. But in saying all of that, I still quite enjoyed reading this. It was like nothing else Lehman has ever wrote. It's a very strange, very odd, but kind of quite fun read. The bit involving the sex slaves in the cages, that is one of the most out there things I think I've ever read by Lehman. It's so weird and so odd, and there's an element of it involving it reveals who's keeping them as slaves, but it doesn't reveal they have an accomplice by name, but you never find out anything about that person. It just wasn't written into the story, which again adds credence to the fact that this has just been assembled. But it's so strange and out there and different to anything else he's done, and it was fascinating. It really was. It was it's the sort of thing that only Lehman could have come up with, but I can't say I didn't find it interesting. It was really weird, and all of the other elements of the story they are all interesting. Whereas something like No Sanctuary, which has got two very clear threads that have been sort of spliced together, feel a bit sluggish. Here it all feels like individually all of these stories could have been pretty good books, but they all feel so completely separate to each other, and it's quite jarring how it goes from one chapter to the next, and you don't know 1 minute to the next where the story's going. It is really, really out there, and it's a lot more complex than the usual Lehman book, but it's definitely interesting, it's definitely fun, it's definitely worth checking out. What I would say, which is a shame, is that two major gripes. Number one, the original paperback version has what I think is the best bit of artwork that Steve Crisp, who illustrated most of Lehman's books, ever did. But on the later editions, all the art was letterboxed. So we had Lehman's name in massive font, and the art itself really scrunched up and hard to see. And it's a real shame, because a lot of the later era artwork's particularly good, but this one is probably the best art that Steve Crisp ever did. It's fully visible on the back of the book, but not on the front, which is a shame. The other thing that I'd mention is that the physical version, there's quite a lot of errors in terms of how it's been printed. There's about 30 pages missing in content. Another chapter is repeated itself later on. There's a sequence which is repeated over and over in the paperback that isn't in the digital version. So the digital version on Kindle is at least more polished up version of the book. And that's how I would recommend, although I champion physical media a lot more, that's how I'd recommend you read this. Also, really tellingly, and there's only other one again. One place that I found this before is that to add to the fact that I honestly do believe this is a sort of a spliced book. The middle of the book has a diary which Imad, the Egyptian guy, finds and reads, which does reference the main book itself and is important to the story. But it's a story that's directly lifted from his Dreadful Tales short story collection. It's a story called Into the Pit, and it's literally been inserted in the middle of this book, right in the centre of this book, word for word. Literally, the entire thing is there. For what reason? Don't know. Just it connects to the story. It's had a few name changes, but it is that same short story which he wrote many years ago. Just spliced right in there, which is really strange. Especially as somebody who I'd read Dreadful Tales prior to reading this, and then just realised I was reading the same thing from a different book. Really weird. But despite the fact that it is a mess, and it is absolutely a mess, this is still a really interesting read. And I do like it a lot more than No Sanctuary because it's a lot more interesting. And it feels, despite the fact that it's actually quite sloppy, it feels a lot more fun than something like The Lake. So that's Amara. An oddity. It's a hard book to find an actual decent physical copy of, unfortunately. Which is a shame because I think that the orange binding and the artwork is superb. But it's one that you can get on Kindle that, unusual, although we're not quite into the section of these books that I would actually term good, I would still recommend layman fans who haven't read this do so, because it's not like anything else he's ever read. It's got all these trademarks in there, but it is a fun read for a book that I'm a bit on the fence for recommending because of how messy this is. This is still a good time read. So that's Amara, an oddity, a really odd book, but a decent one nonetheless.